The white BMW rolled to a stop in front of the small ranch house, and the man behind the wheel lifted his phone to photograph the flag like he was documenting a crime scene. Bradley Whitmore III adjusted his Bluetooth earpiece and stepped onto the cracked driveway, his Italian loafers clicking against concrete that had been poured when Eisenhower was still president. The flag in question hung from a wooden pole mounted beside the front door, its fabric faded by decades of Tennessee sun, its edges frayed by countless storms. What Bradley Whitmore did not know, what no one on Oakwood Lane had ever known, was that this flag had been folded by white-gloved hands at Arlington National Cemetery in January of 1951, and that the old man who flew it had carried his brother's body 6 miles through frozen enemy territory to bring him home. Inside the house, Ezra Nehemiah Vance stood at his ironing board, pressing crisp lines into a replacement flag with hands that trembled slightly from damage done 74 years ago in temperatures that killed men where they stood. He spoke softly to the fabric as he worked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Looking a little tired, Eli." His fingers traced the stripes with the tenderness of a man touching something holy. "But do not worry. I got your backup ready." The iron hissed against cotton, and for a moment Ezra was not in his small kitchen, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere cold, somewhere loud with gunfire and the screams of dying men. The doorbell rang. Ezra set down the iron and walked to the door with the careful precision of a man who had learned long ago that every step mattered. His orthopedic shoes made no sound on the worn linoleum. His plaid shirt was faded but clean, pressed with the same attention he gave the flag. When he opened the door, the afternoon light caught the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a thin white line against weathered skin that most people assumed came from a farming accident or a car crash. They never asked. Ezra never told. Bradley Whitmore held up a piece of paper like a man serving an eviction notice. "Mr. Vance, I am here on behalf of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association." His voice carried across the lawn, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, loud enough to ensure an audience for what he clearly considered a performance. "It has come to our attention that your property is in violation of Community Standard 4.7.2 regarding exterior decorative elements." Ezra looked at the paper, then at the man holding it. "I am sorry, son. I am not sure I understand." Bradley smiled the smile of a man who had rehearsed his speech in the mirror that morning. "The flag." He gestured toward the pole with the back of his hand, dismissive, contemptuous. "It is an eyesore. The colors are faded, the edges are torn, and frankly, it brings down the aesthetic quality of the entire street. We have updated our community guidelines, and decorative items must meet certain standards. That flag does not meet those standards." Across the street, Rosa Martinez had stopped watering her flowers. 2 houses down, Marcus Delgado had paused his dog walk to watch. The neighborhood was listening, and Bradley Whitmore wanted them to listen. Ezra took the paper with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly over the words. When he looked up, his voice was soft, respectful, threaded with something that might have been steel or might have been sorrow. "I appreciate you coming by, Mr. Whitmore, but I believe there may have been some mistake. That flag has flown from this house for 47 years. Bradley's laugh was short and sharp. 47 years of bringing down property values. Look at it. Look at your house." He swept his arm toward the small ranch home, the roses Ezra tended every morning, the porch where he drank his coffee at dawn. "This is not 1970 anymore, Mr. Vance. We're trying to attract young families, young professionals, people who care about appearances. And that ratty old flag sends entirely the wrong message. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. Stories like this one, about quiet courage and hidden heroes, happen in every community. There might be a legend living on your street right now, and you would never know it. Now let us continue. Ezra's fingers touched the paper, traced the official seal of the HOA, the signature of the man standing before him. His voice remained calm, but something shifted in his posture, something ancient and unbending. "This flag is not ratty, son, and it is not coming down." Bradley's eyes narrowed. Mr. Vance, I do not think you understand the situation. The fine for noncompliance is $500. If you refuse to pay, we can place a lien on your property. If you continue to refuse, we can pursue foreclosure. His smile widened. Over a flag. Is that really the hill you want to die on? The phrase hung in the air between them. Hill. D. Words that meant something very different to Ezra Vance than they meant to the man in the Italian loafers. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Whitmore. Ezra's voice was barely above a whisper now, but it carried. That flag stays. Bradley shook his head with theatrical disappointment. You have 72 hours to comply. After that, the fines begin. And trust me, Mr. Vance, you cannot afford this fight. He turned and walked back to his BMW, pausing to take one more photograph of the flag, the house, the old man standing in the doorway. Ezra watched him drive away. Then he walked slowly to the flagpole and stood beneath the fabric that had covered his brother's coffin. His scarred hand reached up to touch the warm material, and his lips moved in words too quiet for anyone to hear. They do not know Eli, and that is all right, but I will not take you down. Not for him. Not for anyone. Rosa Martinez watched from her window as the old man stood there, hand pressed against the flag like he was saying goodbye to someone. Or maybe hello. She had lived next to Ezra Vance for 15 years, had brought in casseroles after Margene passed, had waved to him every morning as he tended his roses. She thought she knew him. But watching him now, watching the way his hand trembled against that fabric, watching the way he stood with his shoulders squared against something she could not see, Rosa realized she did not know him at all. And something told her, something deep in her gut, that this was about far more than cloth and colors. Something told her that the man the HOA had just threatened was carrying a weight that Bradley Whitmore could not begin to imagine. She just did not know how right she was. Ezra Vance woke at 4:30 in the morning, the same time he had woken every morning for 74 years. His body remembered the rhythm of a life lived by discipline, by duty, by the unshakable habit of men who learned that sleeping past dawn could get you killed. The house was dark and silent, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest like a physical weight. He lay still for a moment, listening to the emptiness where Margene's breathing used to be. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the cold that had settled into his bones decades ago and never quite left. The bedroom was spare and neat, the bed made with military corners before his feet touched the floor. On the nightstand sat a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Two faces smiled out from behind the glass. A young woman with dark curls and laughing eyes. A young man in marine dress blues, his arm around her waist, his whole life ahead of him. Ezra touched the frame with trembling fingers. Morning, Margie. Morning, Eli. The kitchen was small but immaculate. Ezra filled the coffee pot with water, measured out the grounds, and set 2 cups on the counter. He had done this every morning for 6 years, ever since Margene passed. He knew she would never drink the second cup. He made it anyway. Some habits were too sacred to break. While the coffee brewed, he stepped onto the front porch and stood beneath the flag. The fabric hung limp in the pre-dawn stillness, waiting for the wind to give it life. Ezra looked up at it and felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that had lived there since a frozen night in December of 1950 when he held his brother's body and watched the light leave his eyes. The cold morning air touched his face, and suddenly he was not in Tennessee anymore. He was in Korea, Chosin Reservoir. The temperature was 35 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze a man's rifle to his hands, cold enough to turn blood to ice before it hit the ground. Ezra could hear the wind howling through the mountain pass, could smell the cordite and the copper and the particular scent of men who knew they were going to die. And he could hear Elijah's voice, young and steady despite everything, cutting through the chaos. Cool enough for you, easy? Ezra blinked, and the memory released him. He was back on his porch, back in the present, his hand pressed against the wooden railing so hard his knuckles had gone white. The coffee pot beeped inside, calling him back to the rituals that kept him anchored to this world instead of the one that lived in his head. He poured 2 cups. He carried them to the small table by the window. He sat in his chair and looked at the empty chair across from him, the one where Margene had sat for 47 years, the one where she had sipped her coffee and read the paper and looked at him with eyes that knew he was carrying something heavy but loved him anyway. She had found the medal in his sock drawer after 40 years of marriage. He could still remember her face when she came to him holding the blue ribbon, the 5-point star, the weight of everything he had never told her. "Why did you never tell me, Ezra?" Her voice had been soft, not accusing, just sad, just wanting to understand. "Because the ones who deserve medals did not come home, Margie." His answer then was the same as his answer now, the same as it had always been. "Because Eli earned that star. I just carried it back." Margene had cried that night, and she had held him while he finally told her about the pass, about the 19 hours, about the 847 Marines who made it home because he and Elijah would not let them die. She had held him while he told her about the grenade, about the 90 seconds, about the last words his brother ever spoke. She had held him, and she had not let go until the sun came up. Now Margene was gone, and the only one left who knew the truth was Ezra himself. He finished his coffee, washed both cups, and dressed in his cleanest clothes. Every Sunday, he made this trip. Every Sunday, without fail. He owed her that much. He owed her more than he could ever repay. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning light. Ezra walked the familiar path to the familiar headstone and lowered himself onto the bench the cemetery had allowed him to install beside her grave. Margene Rose Vance, beloved wife, 1932 to 2019. The words were carved in stone, permanent and insufficient. They wanted to take down Eli's flag. Margie. Ezra's voice was barely audible, meant for no one but the woman beneath the grass. Some young fellow from the HOA. Says it is an eyesore. Says it brings down property values. His laugh was hollow, humorless. Property values. Like that means anything. Like anything means anything without you here. He sat in silence for a long moment, watching the light change as the sun climbed higher. "You know I cannot do that, Margie. You know what that flag means. It is the only thing I have left of him. The only thing besides the memories and the nightmares and the scar on my face where that bayonet caught me." He touched the white line that ran from temple to jaw, the souvenir of a Chinese soldier who had gotten close enough to kill him before Elijah put 3 rounds in the man's chest. "I am tired, Margie. I am so tired. But I will not let them take his flag. Not while I am still breathing." He stayed until the sun was fully up, then walked slowly back to his truck. The drive home took him past the houses of his neighbors, past the manicured lawns and the matching mailboxes and the world that Bradley Whitmore was so desperate to protect. Ezra wondered if any of them knew what it cost to keep them safe. He wondered if any of them cared. When he turned onto Oakwood Lane, he saw it immediately. A second notice, bright yellow against his front door, flapping in the morning breeze like a flag of surrender. He parked the truck and walked to the door with the slow, measured steps of a man who had walked through worse. The notice was taped at eye level, impossible to miss. $500 fine. 72-hour compliance deadline. Sincerely, Bradley Whitmore III, President, Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. Ezra pulled the notice from the door. He read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. Then he walked to the flagpole and stood at attention the way he had stood at attention 10,000 times before, the way his body would never forget how to stand. The flag rippled in the morning wind, faded and frayed and sacred. "I'm still here, Eli." Ezra's words were a whisper, a prayer, a promise. "They can find me. They can take my house. But I will not take you down. Not today. Not ever." 3 houses down, Marcus Delgado was walking his dog when he saw the old man standing at attention beneath his flag. Something about that posture stopped him cold. Something about the precision of it, the stillness, the way Ezra's heels were together and his shoulders were squared and his chin was lifted toward the fabric above him. Marcus had served in Vietnam. He had known men like that, men who carried things they could never put down, men whose bodies remembered wars their minds tried to forget. He watched Ezra Vance for a long moment, a strange feeling growing in his chest. Then his dog pulled at the leash and he walked on, the image of that ramrod posture burning in his memory. He could not shake the feeling that he was missing something. Something important. Something that changed everything. The Oakwood Hills Community Center smelled like stale coffee and fresh carpet, a combination that turned Bradley Whitmore's stomach every time he walked through the door. But tonight was worth the discomfort. Tonight was the night he would finally rid his neighborhood of its most persistent eyesore. He adjusted his sport coat, checked his reflection in the darkened window, and strode to the front of the room where his laptop was already connected to the projector. The folding chairs filled slowly. Retirees in cardigans, young couples with sleeping babies, middle-aged professionals checking their phones. Bradley counted heads and smiled. 18 residents. More than enough for a quorum. More than enough witnesses to his triumph. He clicked to his first slide. The image filled the screen behind him, a photograph of Ezra Vance's house taken from a street. A red circle had been drawn around the flag, and beneath it, in bold letters, were the words primary aesthetic concern. Good evening, everyone. Bradley's voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had taken public speaking courses. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. As you know, property values in Oakwood Hills have increased 12% over the last 18 months. That is a direct result of our commitment to community standards. His smile widened. But we have a problem. He clicked to the next slide. A close-up of the flag, its faded stripes and frayed edges magnified to fill the screen. This flag has been flying from the same house for nearly 50 years. It is sun-bleached, torn, and frankly, it looks like something you would find at a garage sale. I have personally delivered 2 violation notices to the homeowner, Mr. Ezra Vance. He has refused to comply. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rosa Martinez sat in the third row, her hands clenched in her lap, her jaw tight with anger she was struggling to contain. Beside her, Hannah Chun, the history professor who had moved in 2 years ago, was watching Bradley with an expression of growing distaste. Bradley clicked again. This slide showed a graph, property values trending upward with a red dotted line indicating projected growth. Every house that fails to meet our standards costs all of us money. Mr. Vance's property has been assessed at 30% below comparable homes in the area. His flag, his overgrown hedges, his general lack of attention to curb appeal, these things dragged down the entire neighborhood. Rosa's hand shot up. Bradley nodded toward her with the patient condescension of a man humoring a child. Mr. Whitmore, Ezra Vance has lived in that house for 47 years. Rosa's voice was steady but hot. He was here before most of us were born. He tends those roses every single morning. He waves to every person who walks by. And you're standing up there showing pictures of his home like it is some kind of crime scene. Bradley's smile did not waver. I appreciate your sentimentality, Mrs. Martinez. But sentimentality does not protect property values. Mr. Vance is welcome to stay in his home for as long as he likes, provided he complies with the same standards we all agreed to when we purchased property here. He never agreed to anything. Rosa stood now, her voice rising. He was here before there was an HOA, before there were standards, before you showed up 6 months ago and started treating this neighborhood like your personal kingdom. The room shifted. Eyes moved between Rosa and Bradley. The young couples looked uncomfortable. The retirees looked thoughtful. Bradley's smile finally cracked, just for a moment, before reassembling itself. Mrs. Martinez, I understand this is emotional for you. He emphasized the word like an insult. But emotions do not change facts. The flag violates Code 4.7.2. Mr. Vance has 72 hours to comply. If he does not, we will begin levying fines. If he refuses to pay the fines, we will place a lien on his property. And if necessary, we will pursue foreclosure. The word landed like a bomb. Foreclosure. Over a flag. Over a piece of fabric that hurt no one, threatened no one, did nothing but hang from a pole and catch the wind. You cannot be serious. The voice came from the back of the room. Marcus Delgado stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his face carved from stone. You're going to take an 82-year-old man's home because you do not like his flag? Bradley's eyes narrowed. Mr. Delgado, this meeting is for property owners in good standing. Your assessment fees are 3 months overdue. My fees are none of your business. Marcus stepped forward, and something in his bearing made Bradley take a half step back. I served in Vietnam. I know what that flag means to men like Ezra Vance. And I know what men like you mean when you talk about standards and values and aesthetics. You mean power. You mean control. You mean making yourself feel big by making other people feel small. The room was silent now. Bradley's face had flushed red, his composure finally breaking. This meeting is adjourned. His voice was clipped, furious. Mr. Vance has 72 hours. After that, the HOA will pursue all legal remedies available. He gathered his laptop and stalked toward the door, brushing past Marcus without making eye contact. The residents sat in stunned silence, watching him go. Rosa turned to Hannah Chun, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We have to do something. We cannot let him take Ezra's home. Hannah nodded slowly, her mind already working. She had lived next to Ezra for 2 years. She had waved to him, smiled at him, watched him tend his roses with the patience of a man who had learned that some things could not be rushed. She had always sensed there was more to him than met the eye. Now she was certain of it. I want to talk to him. Hannah's voice was quiet but firm. There is something about that flag. Something we do not know. Did you see the way he held himself when Bradley threatened him? Like a soldier. Like a man who has faced worse than lawyers and fines. Rosa remembered watching Ezra through her window, his hand pressed against the flag, his whole body trembling with something that looked like grief, or maybe love, or maybe both. He has a box. Rosa's voice was barely above a whisper. I saw him holding it the other day. Small, wooden, polished like something precious. He put it away when he saw me watching. Marcus had joined them now, his face troubled. Metals come in boxes like that. He spoke slowly, like a man working through a puzzle. My father's Purple Heart came in a box like that. So did his Bronze Star. The three of them looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Something was happening here. Something bigger than an HOA dispute. Something that went back further than any of them could guess. Outside, the sun was setting over Oakwood Lane. And on the porch of the small house at the end of the street, Ezra Vance sat in his chair, watching the light fade, talking softly to a flag that could not hear him, but listened anyway. They are coming for you, Eli. His voice was tired, worn down by years and grief and the weight of secrets kept too long. But I will not let them win. Not while I am still breathing. Not while I still have strength to stand. The flag rippled in the evening breeze, faded and frayed and utterly undefeated. The wooden box sat on Ezra's kitchen table, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. He had not opened it in months. Some days the weight of what lay inside was too heavy to bear. But tonight, with Bradley Whitmore's threats echoing in his ears and the clock ticking toward a deadline he had no intention of meeting, Ezra needed to remember why he was fighting. His fingers found the small brass clasp and lifted the lid. The Medal of Honor gleamed against the dark velvet lining, its 5-point star catching the kitchen light like a fragment of something holy. The pale blue ribbon was slightly faded now, but the inscription on the back remained clear. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Ezra touched the cool metal with trembling fingers, and the past reached up and pulled him under. December 1st, 1950. Chosin Reservoir, North Korea. The cold was a living thing, a predator that hunted men with patient, merciless precision. Ezra could feel it now. 74 years later, the way it had crept through his boots and his gloves and his layers of wool, until it found his bones and made a home there. 35 degrees below zero. Cold enough to freeze a canteen solid in 20 minutes. Cold enough to jam a rifle if you breathed on it wrong. Cold enough to kill. His squad had number 12 when they took position at the pass. 12 Marines tasked with holding a corridor through the mountains while the rest of the division retreated from the Chinese forces that had poured across the border in waves of endless, impossible numbers. The 80th Division. Thousands of soldiers against 12 men and a frozen piece of rock that happened to be the only way out. Elijah had been on his left. Always on his left. His younger brother by 3 years, the boy who had followed him into the recruiter's office and signed his name before Ezra could talk him out of it. Elijah, with his easy smile and his steady hands and his absolute refusal to let his brother face anything alone. Cold enough for you, easy? Elijah's breath had fogged in the darkness, his voice light despite the terror that must have been clawing at his chest. Could be worse. Could be back home listening to Mama complain about the weather. Ezra had laughed, or tried to. The sound came out cracked and frozen, but Elijah grinned anyway. That same grin he had worn since childhood, the one that said everything would be fine as long as they were together. The first wave came at midnight. Ezra could still hear it. The bugles, the whistles, the thunder of thousands of feet on frozen ground. The Chinese did not try to hide their approach. They wanted you to hear them coming. They wanted you to know that death was walking toward you, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. But Ezra stopped it. For 19 hours, he stopped it. When the squad was reduced to 5, he ordered the wounded to fall back with 2 men to carry them. When it was reduced to 3, he ordered the last able-bodied Marine to go with them. That left Ezra and Elijah alone on the ridge, 2 brothers from Tennessee holding a mountain pass against an army. They fought through the night. They fought through the dawn. They fought until their rifles jammed, and they fixed bayonets and fought with steel. Ezra took a blade across his face, felt the hot rush of blood freezing almost instantly against his skin, and kept fighting. Elijah took a round through his shoulder and kept firing with his offhand, his teeth gritted against pain he would never complain about. And then came the grenade. Ezra saw it arc through the gray morning light, spinning end over end, landing in the snow 3 feet from the cluster of wounded Marines he had been dragging toward the extraction point. Time slowed. Sound faded. He saw the grenade. He saw the wounded men. He saw that he was too far away to reach it, too far away to throw it back, too far away to do anything but watch them die. But Elijah was not too far away. Ezra watched his brother throw himself onto the grenade like a man diving into water. He watched the snow erupt in a geyser of red and white. He heard the sound, muffled by Elijah's body, a sound that would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his life. He was at Elijah's side in an instant, cradling the broken body of the boy who had followed him everywhere, who had never let him face anything alone. Elijah's eyes were open, focused on Ezra's face with an intensity that defied the damage done to his body. "Told you I would watch your back, Izzy." The words came out wet, bubbling, fading. "Get them home. Promise me." "I promise." Ezra's voice broke on the word. "I promise, Illy. I promise." Elijah smiled that same easy smile, the one from childhood, the one that said everything would be fine. And then the light left his eyes, and Ezra was alone on a frozen mountain holding his brother's body while 847 Marines retreated to safety through the pass he had held. He carried Elijah 6 miles through enemy territory. He would not leave him. He could not leave him. The Chinese let him go. Maybe they respected what he had done. Maybe they were too shocked to stop him. Maybe God himself reached down and held back the bullets. Ezra never knew. He only knew that he walked through the snow with his brother in his arms. And when he finally reached American lines, he collapsed and did not wake up for 3 days. They gave him the Medal of Honor. They called him a hero. They wrote his name in history books and taught his actions at military academies and whispered his call sign with reverence in places where warriors gathered. Shepherd, because he brought his men home. But Ezra never felt like a hero. Heroes saved everyone. Heroes did not let their brothers die. Heroes did not spend 74 years carrying a weight that grew heavier with every passing day. He closed the box. The kitchen light seemed dimmer now, the silence heavier. Outside, the flag rippled in the night wind. Elijah's flag, the one that had covered his coffin at Arlington, the one that Ezra had flown every day since as a promise kept and a penance paid. "You were the hero, Eli." Ezra's whisper was barely audible. "You were always the hero. I'm just the one who lived." He sat at the table until the darkness outside began to soften toward dawn. And when the first light touched the flag, he was still there, keeping vigil, keeping faith, keeping a promise made on a frozen mountain to a brother who would never grow old. Outside, The sound of voices began to drift through the morning air. Multiple voices. And through his window, Ezra saw Bradley Whitmore's white BMW turning onto Oakwood Lane. This time, he was not alone. Bradley Whitmore stepped out of his BMW with the confidence of a man who had brought reinforcements. Behind him, a silver sedan parked at the curb, and a woman in a charcoal suit emerged carrying a leather briefcase. The HOA attorney. Bradley had called in the professionals. 2 board members followed in a separate car, their faces tight with the discomfort of people who had been pressured into something they did not fully support. But Bradley did not need their enthusiasm. He only needed their presence. Witnesses to the moment when the old man finally surrendered. The morning sun was bright over Oakwood Lane, and the flag hung limp in the still air, waiting. Ezra stood on his porch, his posture straight despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had spent the night with ghosts, and now he would face the living. Mr. Vance. Bradley's voice carried across the lawn with theatrical authority. Your 72 hours have expired. I have brought our legal counsel to explain your options. He smiled, the smile of a man savoring his victory. Though I should warn you, none of them involve keeping that flag. Ezra said nothing. His eyes moved from Bradley to the attorney to the board members, shifting uncomfortably behind them. Then his gaze drifted past them to the houses beyond, where curtains were moving and doors were opening and the neighborhood was waking to the confrontation on his lawn. Rosa Martinez was already outside, her arms crossed, her face set in an expression of fierce protectiveness. Marcus Delgado stood at the edge of his property, watching with eyes that missed nothing. Hannah Chun had emerged from her house with her phone in her hand, recording. The attorney stepped forward, her heels sinking slightly into the grass. Mr. Vance, my name is Patricia Holbrook. I represent the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a sheaf of papers. I have here a formal notice of violation, a schedule of fines, and a preliminary filing for property lien. If you continue to refuse compliance, we will have no choice but to pursue foreclosure proceedings. Ezra listened to the words as if they were coming from very far away. Foreclosure. Lien. Compliance. Legal terms for a simple truth. They wanted to take his brother's flag, and if he refused, they would take his home. Mom. His voice was soft, respectful, steady. I appreciate you coming all this way, but that flag is not coming down. Bradley stepped forward, his patience finally cracking. Look at yourself, old man. Look at this house. You're living in the past. The world has moved on. This neighborhood has moved on. And you're standing here, clinging to a piece of cloth like it means something. It does mean something. Ezra's words were quiet, but they carried. It means everything. Bradley laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Everything? It is a flag? You can buy one just like it at any hardware store for $20. Take it down, put up a new one that does not look like it survived a war, and we can all move on with our lives. The phrase hung in the air. Survived a war. Bradley did not know how right he was. More neighbors had gathered now. A dozen people stood on the sidewalk, watching the confrontation unfold. Among them, Ezra noticed a young man in a faded army t-shirt, his eyes fixed on Ezra with an intensity that seemed out of place. The young man's hand kept moving to his chest, touching something beneath his shirt. Dog tags, perhaps. The unconscious habit of a soldier. Mr. Vance. The attorney's voice was professionally sympathetic, the tone of someone delivering bad news they did not personally care about. I understand this is difficult, but the law is clear. You signed the HOA agreement when you purchased this property. You are bound by its terms. I never signed anything. Ezra's response was simple, factual. I bought this house in 1977. There was no HOA then, no agreement, no terms. The attorney hesitated, glancing at Bradley. Mr. Whitmore assured me that all residents had signed the updated covenant when it was implemented in 2019. I did not sign it. Ezra met her eyes calmly. I was asked to. I declined. My wife was sick. I had other concerns. Bradley's face flushed red. That does not matter. The covenant applies to all properties within the designated boundaries. Your signature is not required for enforcement. Actually, a new voice cut through the tension. Hannah, Chun stepped forward, her phone still recording. Actually, that is not accurate. I teach contract law as part of my history curriculum. A covenant cannot be enforced against a property owner who did not consent to its terms. If Mr. Vance never signed the agreement, your entire case falls apart. Bradley turned on her with barely contained fury. Stay out of this. This is HOA business. This is my neighbor's business. Hannah did not flinch, and I'm making it mine. The attorney was flipping through her papers now, her composure cracking. She leaned toward Bradley and whispered something Ezra could not hear. Bradley's face went from red to white in an instant. This is not over. Bradley's voice was low, dangerous. I do not care what the paperwork says. That flag is an eyesore, and it is coming down. He stepped toward the porch, and something shifted in Ezra's posture. The old man did not move, did not raise his hands, did not speak. But suddenly he seemed larger somehow, more solid, as if the years had fallen away and something ancient and dangerous had risen to take their place. Marcus saw it. The young veteran in the army shirt saw it. Rosa saw it without understanding what she was seeing. Bradley saw it too. He stopped mid-step, his body responding to a threat his mind could not identify. So, Ezra's voice was different now. Harder, colder. The voice of a man who had faced armies. I have asked you politely. I have listened to your terms. I have respected your position. But I will tell you this once, and I will not tell you again. That flag is not coming down. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. And if you set foot on my property again without my permission, you will regret it. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Bradley backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Ezra's face. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Something had changed in the air between them, some balance of power that had shifted without a word being spoken. The attorney gathered her papers. The board members retreated to their car. Bradley climbed into his BMW and sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine and driving away. Rosa was at Ezra's side before the car had turned the corner. Her hand found his arm, and she felt him trembling. Not with fear, with something else. Something that had been held inside for far too long. Ezra. Her voice was gentle. What was that? He did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the flag, rippling now in a breeze that had finally risen. That was a man who has had enough. Marcus spoke from the sidewalk, his voice rough with emotion. That was a man who has drawn a line. Hannah lowered her phone, her face pale. Who are you, Mr. Vance? The question was barely a whisper. What happened to you? Ezra looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked into his house, closing the door softly behind him. Outside, the neighbors stood in silence, staring at the flag, wondering what secrets it held, wondering what they had just witnessed, wondering who the quiet old man at the end of the street really was. The afternoon light slanted through Rose's kitchen windows as she poured coffee for the small group gathered around her table. Marcus sat with his hands wrapped around his mug, staring at the dark liquid as if it held answers. Hannah had her laptop open, her fingers moving across the keyboard with increasing urgency. The young veteran from the crowd, who had introduced himself as Tyler Reeves, sat apart from the others, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. Something happened to him over there. Marcus spoke without looking up. I know that look. I have seen it in the mirror. That man has carried something heavy for a very long time. Rosa nodded slowly. 15 years I have lived next to him. 15 years of casseroles and waves and small talk over the fence. And I never knew. She paused, her voice catching. Margine knew. She must have known, but she never said a word. Hannah stopped typing and turned her laptop to face the group. I have been searching military databases, public records, Medal of Honor recipients from the Korean War. She took a breath. There were 146 medals awarded for Korea. Most of the recipients are deceased now, but there are records, photographs, citations. Tyler leaned forward, his eyes sharp. You think the old man is one of them? I think that flag means more than we understand. Hannah scrolled through a page of names and photographs. Young faces frozen in time. Boys who had become legends. And I think whatever happened to Mr. Vance, it happened a long time ago in a place most of us have never heard of. Marcus set down his mug with a heavy thunk. Chosen Reservoir. The words came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. December 1950. The Frozen Chosen. Worst battle of the entire war. 30,000 Marines surrounded by over 100,000 Chinese soldiers. They fought their way out through 17 miles of frozen hell. Most of them did not make it. The room went silent. Outside, through Rosa's window, they could see Ezra's house at the end of the street, the flag hanging motionless in the still afternoon air. My father talked about Chosen. Marcus continued, his voice distant. He was not there, but he knew men who were. He said the ones who survived were never the same. He said they carried the cold inside them for the rest of their lives. Hannah turned back to her laptop and typed rapidly. Chosen Reservoir. Medal of Honor. She scrolled through results, her face tightening with concentration. There are 17 Medal of Honor recipients from Chosen. Most posthumous, but a few survived. She clicked on a link and went still. What is it? Rosa's voice was barely above a whisper. Hannah did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the screen, her face growing paler with each line she read. Finally, she turned the laptop again, and the group leaned in to see. The photograph was old, black and white, showing a young Marine in dress blues standing at attention. The face was lean and serious, the jaw set with determination, the eyes holding something that looked like grief and pride and terrible knowledge all at once. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, fresh and raw in the photograph, a white line against dark skin. Oh my God! Rosa pressed her hand to her mouth. That is him. That is Ezra. Hannah read aloud from the citation, her voice trembling. Staff Sergeant Ezra Nehemiah Vance, United States Marine Corps. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving with Company B, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, in action against enemy aggressor forces at the Chosen Reservoir, Korea, on December 1st, 1950. She paused, swallowing hard, then continued. When his squad was reduced by casualties to 2 men, Staff Sergeant Vance ordered the surviving Marine to withdraw with the wounded and single-handedly held a vital mountain pass for 19 hours against repeated enemy assaults, allowing 847 Marines to retreat to safety. Despite being wounded multiple times, Staff Sergeant Vance maintained his position until reinforcements arrived. His actions saved the lives of countless fellow Marines and reflected great credit upon himself and the United States Naval Service. The kitchen was utterly silent. Tyler had tears streaming down his face. Marcus sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. Rosa wept openly, her shoulders shaking. 19 hours. Marcus's voice cracked. Alone. Against an army. Hannah scrolled down, and her breath caught. There's more. She read silently for a moment, then spoke again, her voice breaking. His brother, Private First Class Elijah Thomas Vance, killed in action during the same engagement, threw himself on a grenade to save 3 wounded Marines. Posthumous Navy Cross. She looked up at the others, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. Staff Sergeant Vance carried his brother's body 6 miles through enemy territory to American lines. He refused to leave him behind. Rosa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The flag. Her voice was choked, barely audible. That flag on his porch is not just any flag. Hannah nodded slowly. Arlington National Cemetery. January 1951. Private First Class Elijah Thomas Vance was buried with full military honors. The flag that draped his coffin was presented to his next of kin, his brother. Marcus finished the thought, his voice hollow. Ezra has been flying his brother's flag for 74 years. The weight of it settled over the room like a physical thing. 74 years of silence. 74 years of tending roses and waving to neighbors and keeping a secret that would have made him a legend if only he had spoken. But he never spoke. He never asked for recognition. He only asked to be left alone with his brother's flag and his brother's memory and the weight of a promise made on a frozen mountain. Tyler wiped his face with the back of his hand. What do we do? His voice was young, urgent, desperate to act. We cannot let that HOA guy take his flag. We cannot let him take his house. Rosa straightened, something fierce rising in her eyes. No, we cannot. She looked out the window at the quiet street, at the houses where neighbors lived their ordinary lives, at the small ranch house at the end where an extraordinary man had hidden in plain sight for nearly half a century. Bradley Whitmore wants a fight. Rosa's voice was steel now. All tears burned away. Then we will give him one. Marcus nodded, rising from his chair. I know people, veterans, men and women who understand what that flag means. Give me until morning. Hannah closed her laptop with a decisive click. And I know how to make sure the whole country understands. She paused, her eyes meeting Rosa's. Mr. Vance has kept his secret for 74 years. We need to ask permission before we share it. Rosa looked toward Ezra's house, where the flag had begun to stir in an evening breeze that was finally rising. Then let's go ask him. The knock on Ezra's door was soft, almost apologetic. He had been sitting in his chair by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky, talking to Elijah the way he did every evening. The knock interrupted him mid-sentence, and for a moment he considered not answering. He was tired of fighting, tired of explaining, tired of carrying a weight that grew heavier with every passing year. But the knock came again, and something in its gentleness made him rise. Rosa stood on his porch with Hannah and Marcus behind her. Their faces were different now, changed by something they had learned, softened by something they had come to understand. Ezra saw it in their eyes and knew immediately that his secret was no longer his alone. You found out. His voice was flat, neither accusation nor question. Simply fact. Rosa nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Ezra, I am so sorry. We did not mean to pry. We just wanted to understand why the flag mattered so much. And then Hannah found the records, and we read what you did, what your brother did, and we... Her voice broke. She could not finish. Ezra stood in the doorway for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he stepped aside and gestured them in. The house was small and neat, every surface clean, every item in its place. The wooden box sat on the kitchen table where Ezra had left it the night before, its lid closed, its contents hidden. Rosa's eyes went to it immediately, but she said nothing. Ezra lowered himself into his chair and motioned for the others to sit. They arranged themselves on the worn sofa, close together, as if drawing strength from proximity. What do you want to know? Ezra's question was simple, direct. Marcus leaned forward. We want to know why you never told anyone. 74 years. You could have been a hero. Parades, ceremonies, recognition. Instead, you lived here in silence, letting people like Bradley Whitmore treat you like you were nothing. Ezra's eyes moved to the window, to the flag visible through the glass, dark now against the darkening sky. I'm not a hero. His voice was quiet but firm. Heroes save everyone. Heroes do not let their brothers die. I held that pass for 19 hours, and yes, 847 Marines made it home because of it. But Elijah did not make it home. Not alive. And every day since then, I have asked myself the same question. Why him? Why not me? Rosa wiped her eyes. That was not your fault. He made a choice. He saved those men. He saved those men because I could not. Ezra turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of the grief he carried. I was too far away. I saw the grenade land. I saw those wounded boys lying there. And I knew I could not reach it in time. But Eli could. Eli was always faster than me. Always braver. Always better. His voice cracked, a fissure in the wall he had built around himself. He was 19 years old. He had not even kissed a girl yet. He used to talk about coming home and asking Mary Catherine Hollis to the church social. He had his whole life ahead of him, and he threw it away to save 3 men he had never met, because that is who he was. That is who my brother was. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Hannah spoke gently. The flag on your porch. It was his. Ezra nodded. They gave it to me at Arlington. folded it 13 times, and placed it in my hands, and thanked me for his sacrifice. His sacrifice. Like I had anything to do with it. Like I deserved to hold the flag that covered his coffin. He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes ancient and wounded and somehow still unbroken. I fly that flag every day because it is the only way I know to keep him alive. When the wind catches it, I can almost hear him laughing. When the sun hits it just right, I can almost see his smile. That flag is not cloth and colors. That flag is my brother, and I will not take him down. Not for Bradley Whitmore. Not for anyone. Marcus stood abruptly and walked to the window. He stood at attention without seeming to realize it, his silhouette rigid against the fading light. We want to help you. His voice was rough. We want to fight for you, but we need your permission. Ezra frowned. Permission for what? To tell your story. Hannah's voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. To let people know who you are and what that flag means. Bradley Whitmore is not going to stop. He's going to keep coming until he wins or until something stops him. And the only thing that will stop him is the truth. Ezra was silent for a long moment. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, to the place where Elijah's dog tags hung beside his own, hidden beneath his shirt. I have kept this secret for 74 years. His voice was barely above a whisper. Margene was the only one who knew. She found the medal by accident, and I told her everything, and she held me while I cried for the first time since Korea. When she died, I thought the secret would die with me. I thought that was what I wanted. He paused, his eyes finding the flag through the window. But Eli never got the recognition he deserved. They gave him a Navy Cross and buried him in Arlington and then forgot about him. Everyone remembers my name, the Shepherd of Chosen. But nobody remembers the 19-year-old boy who threw himself on a grenade so 3 strangers could live. Rosa moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his weathered hand in both of hers. Then let us remember him. Let's tell the world about Elijah Vance. Not just about the hero who held the pass, but about the brother who gave everything. Ezra looked down at her hand on his, the first gentle touch he had felt in years. Something shifted in his face, some wall crumbling, some door opening that had been sealed for decades. All right, the word came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. Tell them about Eli. Tell them what he did. Tell them why that flag flies. He looked up at the 3 of them, these neighbors who had become something more, these strangers who had become family. But I will not hide anymore. If the world is going to know, then I'm going to stand up and tell them myself. Eli deserves that much. He deserves to have his brothers speak his name out loud, after 74 years of whispers. Marcus turned from the window, and Ezra saw tears on the old soldier's face. Then we stand with you. Whatever comes tomorrow, you will not face it alone. Ezra nodded slowly. Outside, the flag rustled in the night breeze, and somewhere in the darkness, it almost sounded like laughter. For the first time in 74 years, Ezra Vance smiled. Bradley Whitmore arrived at 9 o'clock the next morning with fire in his eyes and a court order in his hand. He had spent the night on the phone with lawyers, with board members, with anyone who would listen to his grievances about the old man who had dared to defy him. The unsigned covenant was a setback, nothing more. There were other angles. Code violations, property maintenance issues, zoning technicalities. Bradley Whitmore had not built his real estate empire by accepting defeat, and he was not about to start now. His BMW turned onto Oakwood Lane, and he slammed the brakes so hard his coffee spilled across his Italian leather seats. Every house on the street had raised an American flag. They hung from porches and poles and makeshift brackets hastily screwed into siding. Some were new, their colors bright and crisp. Others were old, pulled from closets and attics and storage boxes where they had waited for a moment exactly like this. They lined both sides of the street like an honor guard, rippling in the morning breeze, a silent declaration of solidarity that stopped Bradley Whitmore cold. He sat in his car for a full minute, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Then he stepped out and walked toward Ezra's house, his expensive shoes striking the pavement with the sharp crack of a man who refused to be intimidated. The crowd was already gathering. Rosa stood on her lawn with her arms crossed. Marcus had positioned himself at the edge of Ezra's property, his posture military straight, his eyes tracking Bradley's approach with cold assessment. Hannah stood near the sidewalk with her phone raised, the red recording light blinking steadily. Tyler Reeves had brought friends, for other young veterans in faded military t-shirts, their faces set with the quiet determination of men who understood what was at stake. And on the porch, standing beneath his brother's flag, Ezra Vance waited. He was dressed differently today. Not the faded plaid and worn khakis of his daily life, but a white dress shirt, pressed and clean, tucked into dark trousers with a crease sharp enough to cut paper. His shoes were polished. His silver hair was combed with military precision. And around his neck, visible for the first time in 74 years, hung 2 sets of dog tags. Bradley stopped at the edge of the lawn, suddenly uncertain. Something had changed. The old man he had mocked and threatened and dismissed was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely. Someone whose eyes held the weight of history. Someone whose bearing spoke of battles fought and brothers lost, and promises kept across decades of silence. Mr. Vance. Bradley's voice was loud, playing to the crowd, but there was a tremor in it now that had not been there before. I have a court order requiring you to address multiple code violations on this property. You have 24 hours to comply or face immediate legal consequences. He held up the paper like a weapon, like proof of his power, like the final word in an argument he had already won. Ezra did not move. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried across the lawn with perfect clarity. I spent 19 hours on a frozen mountain in Korea, Mr. Whitmore. Alone, in temperatures that froze men solid where they stood. I held a pass against 3 waves of Chinese infantry, so that 847 Marines could retreat to safety. I watched my brother throw himself on a grenade to save 3 wounded men. I carried his body 6 miles through enemy territory because I could not leave him behind. Bradley's face had gone pale. The court order trembled in his hand. Ezra continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. That flag you want me to take down, cover my brother's coffin at Arlington National Cemetery. He was 19 years old. He never got to come home. He never got to marry the girl he loved. He never got to grow old and tend roses and wave to his neighbors. He gave everything, Mr. Whitmore. Everything, so that men he had never met could live. The crowd had grown. Neighbors who had never spoken to Ezra were standing on the sidewalk, tears streaming down their faces. Cars had stopped in the street, their drivers emerging to bear witness. Someone had called the local news, and a van with a satellite dish was pulling up at the end of the block. Ezra stepped down from his porch and walked toward Bradley with the measured stride of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. You could take my house. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. You could take everything I own, but you will not take that flag, and you will not take my brother's memory. Not today. Not ever. Bradley stumbled backward, his court order falling from nerveless fingers. He looked around at the flags lining the street, at the faces of his neighbors staring at him with contempt and disgust, at the news camera now pointed directly at his face. You should have left him alone. Marcus's voice cut through the silence. You picked a fight with the wrong man. Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his adult life, Bradley Whitmore III had nothing to say. And then he made his final mistake. Whether it was desperation or rage, or simply the refusal to accept defeat, something in Bradley snapped. He lunged forward, reaching for the flagpole on Ezra's porch, his manicured fingers grasping for the rope that would lower the flag. Do not touch that flag. Marcus shouted the warning, already moving. But Bradley's hand had already closed on the rope, and in his frantic pulling, his elbow caught Ezra's chest and sent the 82-year-old man stumbling backward. Ezra caught himself on the porch railing, his sleeve riding up as he gripped the wood. And there, exposed for everyone to see, was a tattoo that had been hidden for 74 years. Faded ink on weathered skin, coordinates, a date, and beneath them, in simple block letters, a single name. Elijah. Hannah's camera captured everything. The tattoo, Bradley's face as he realized what he had done. The moment when every person on that street understood that they were standing in the presence of something sacred. Tyler Reeves stepped forward, his voice shaking. Those coordinates. He had gone pale, his military training allowing him to read what others could not. I know those coordinates. That is the chosen reservoir. December 1st, 1950. He turned to face the crowd, tears cutting tracks down his young face. That is the most famous last stand in Marine Corps history. He pointed at Ezra with a trembling hand. That man is the shepherd of chosen. That man is a Medal of Honor recipient. And that flag belonged to his brother, who died a hero. The silence that followed was absolute. And in that silence, Bradley Whitmore finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a battlefield. Medal of Honor. Shepherd of chosen. The crowd stood frozen, processing what they had just heard, struggling to reconcile the legend with the quiet old man they had passed on the street for years without a second glance. Marcus was the first to move. He walked slowly toward Ezra, his steps deliberate, his bearing shifting into something formal and ancient. When he reached the porch, he stopped, drew himself to attention, and raised his right hand in a salute that trembled with emotion. Staff Sergeant Vance. His voice cracked on the words. It is an honor, sir. Ezra looked at him for a long moment, his eyes bright with tears he had not shed in decades. Then he returned the salute with the precision of a man whose body had never forgotten, whose muscles still remembered the weight of duty and the price of service. Tyler Reeves followed, snapping to attention beside Marcus, his young face streaked with tears. One by one, the other veterans in the crowd stepped forward. An elderly man in a Korea veteran's cap who had driven over from the next neighborhood after seeing the flags. A woman in her 50s wearing a Navy anchor pin. A young Marine home on leave who had heard the commotion and walked over to investigate. They formed a line on Ezra's lawn, standing at attention, saluting a man who had refused to call himself a hero for 74 years. The news camera captured everything. Hannah kept her phone steady, documenting history as it unfolded on a quiet suburban street in Tennessee. Rosa wept openly, her hand pressed to her heart, watching the man she had known as a neighbor transformed into something far greater. Bradley Whitmore stood apart from the crowd, his face ashen, his court order lying forgotten in the grass at his feet. He watched the salutes with the dawning horror of a man who had finally understood the depth of his mistake. He had tried to take a flag from a war hero. He had put his hands on a Medal of Honor recipient. He had mocked and threatened and bullied a man who had held a mountain pass alone against an army. The reporter from the news van pushed through the crowd, microphone extended. Sir, can you tell us what happened here? Is it true you are the shepherd of chosen? Ezra looked at the microphone, then at the camera, then at the faces of his neighbors watching him with awe and reverence and something that looked like love. He had kept his silence for 74 years. He had hidden from recognition, from honor, from everything the world had tried to give him. But he had made a promise last night, a promise to speak his brother's name. My name is Ezra Nehemiah Vance. His voice was steady now, carrying across the lawn and into the camera and out to a world that had forgotten him. Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. I served at the Chosin Reservoir in December of 1950. He paused, touching the dog tags at his chest. But I'm not the hero of this story. The hero was my brother, Private First Class Elijah Thomas Vance. He was 19 years old when he threw himself on a grenade to save 3 wounded Marines. He died in my arms on a frozen mountain, and his last words were a request that I get our boys home safe. Ezra's voice broke, but he pressed on. That flag on my porch covered his coffin at Arlington. I have flown it every day since 1951 because it is the only way I know to keep him with me. It is not an eyesore. It is not a violation of community standards. It is my brother, and I will fly it until the day I die. The reporter had tears in her eyes. Her cameraman's hand was shaking. The crowd stood in stunned silence, bearing witness to a grief that had been carried alone for 3/4 of a century. Then a voice cut through the stillness. Shepherd. The word came from the back of the crowd, spoken by an old man, making his way forward with the help of a wooden cane. He was ancient, his face a map of wrinkles, his body bent by time and hardship. But his eyes were sharp, and they were fixed on Ezra with an intensity that made the crowd part before him. Ezra went still. His face changed, recognition dawning like sunrise after a long, dark night. Corporal Jennings? The name came out as a whisper. The old man stopped at the edge of the lawn, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. You carried me. His voice shook with emotion. December 1st, 1950. I took shrapnel in both legs. Could not walk. You threw me over your shoulder and carried me half a mile to the extraction point while the Chinese were shooting at us from every direction. He took another step forward, his cane tapping against the ground. I have spent 74 years wondering what happened to the man who saved my life. I named my son Ezra. I named my grandson Ezra. And I have told the story of the shepherd of Chosen to anyone who would listen. The two old men stood face to face now, separated by 3 feet of grass and 7 decades of silence. I thought you were dead. Corporal Jennings's voice cracked. They told me you were dead. They told me you died holding that pass. Ezra shook his head slowly. Not dead, just tired, just trying to live with what I could not forget. Jennings reached out and gripped Ezra's arm with a strength that belied his age. You saved us. All of us. 847 Marines went home because of what you did. We had families, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. All of them exist because you would not let us die. He pulled Ezra into an embrace, 2 old soldiers holding each other on a suburban lawn while the world watched and wept. Eli saved you. Ezra's voice was muffled against Jennings' shoulder. I just carried you out. Eli threw himself on that grenade. Eli was the hero. Jennings pulled back, his hands on Ezra's shoulders, his eyes fierce. Then let us honor him. Both of you. The way you should have been honored 74 years ago. He turned to face the crowd, raising his voice with surprising strength. This man is the shepherd of Chosen. His brother was Elijah Vance, who gave his life for his fellow Marines. And that flag deserves to fly forever. The crowd erupted. Applause and cheers and weeping all mixed together into a sound that washed over Ezra like a wave, like absolution, like something he had waited his entire life to hear without knowing he was waiting. And on the porch behind him, his brother's flag caught the wind and unfurled fully for the first time in days, rippling against the bright blue sky like a banner of triumph. The black sedan arrived without sirens or fanfare, sliding quietly to the curb behind the news van. 2 men in marine dress blues stepped out, their uniforms immaculate, their bearing unmistakable. The crowd parted before them like water around stone, whispers rippling through the gathered neighbors as the officers made their way toward the porch. The senior officer was a colonel, his chest heavy with ribbons, his silver hair cropped close, his eyes scanning the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who had commanded thousands. Beside him walked a younger captain, carrying a leather folder and wearing an expression of barely contained emotion. The colonel stopped at the edge of Ezra's lawn and surveyed the flags lining the street, the veterans standing at attention, the old man in the white dress shirt who stood at the center of it all. Then he removed his cover, tucked it under his arm, and walked forward with slow, measured steps. Staff Sergeant Vance. The colonel's voice carried the weight of ceremony, of ritual, of something sacred being enacted. I am Colonel William Morrison, United States Marine Corps, representing the Commandant's office. Ezra straightened, his body responding to the presence of rank with reflexes that 74 years of civilian life had not erased. His hands started to rise in salute, but Colonel Morrison stopped him. No, Staff Sergeant. The colonel's voice softened. Today, we salute you. He stepped back, drew himself to attention, and rendered a salute so crisp it seemed to cut the air. The captain beside him followed suit. Behind them, Tyler and Marcus and every veteran present snapped their hands to their brows in unison. Ezra stood motionless, overwhelmed, his eyes glistening as he returned the salute with a steadiness that belied the storm inside him. Colonel Morrison held the salute for a long moment before lowering his hand. He nodded to the captain, who opened the leather folder and withdrew a document bearing official seals and signatures. Staff Sergeant Ezra Nehemiah Vance. The captain read aloud, his voice carrying across the silent lawn. Medal of Honor recipient for actions above and beyond the call of duty at the Chosin Reservoir, Korea, December 1st, 1950. It is the honor of the United States Marine Corps to recognize your service and sacrifice, which has never been forgotten. The colonel stepped forward, his hand extended not for a handshake, but to grip Ezra's arm in the manner of brothers, of warriors, of men who understood what words could never fully express. I have studied your action at Chosin my entire career. Colonel Morrison spoke quietly now, for Ezra alone, though every word carried in the stillness. Every officer candidate at Quantico learns about the shepherd. What you did that night is taught as the definition of courage under fire. Ezra shook his head slowly. Eli was the courageous one. I just did what needed doing. Colonel Morrison's grip tightened on his arm. Your brother's sacrifice is also part of that lesson. Staff Sergeant, Private First Class Elijah Vance, is remembered. His name is spoken with reverence in every class, every year. He is not forgotten. Something broke inside Ezra then. Something that had been held together by silence and solitude and the sheer force of will for 74 years. His shoulders shook. Tears spilled down the weathered lines of his face. And for the first time since the day he buried his brother, Ezra Vance wept openly, without shame, without hiding. Rosa was at his side in an instant, her arm around his waist, steadying him. Marcus moved to his other side. Hannah lowered her phone, tears streaming down her own face, recognizing that some moments were too sacred to record. The colonel waited, patient and respectful, as Ezra composed himself. When the old man finally looked up, his eyes were red but clear, and something in his expression had changed. The weight was still there, but it was lighter now. Shared. Colonel. Ezra's voice was rough but steady. That flag on my porch. It covered my brother's coffin at Arlington. I have flown it every day since they folded it into my hands. And there is a man here who tried to make me take it down. He turned slowly, his eyes finding Bradley Whitmore in the crowd. Bradley had tried to slip away during the ceremony, but the press of bodies had trapped him, forced him to witness every moment of his own humiliation. That man, Ezra pointed with a steady hand. Bradley Whitmore. He called my brother's flag an eyesore. He threatened to take my home. He put his hands on me, trying to tear it down. I turned to Bradley. The news camera swung to capture his face, pale and sweating, his arrogance stripped away to reveal the small, frightened man beneath. Colonel Morrison turned to regard Bradley with an expression of cold contempt. The temperature on the lawn seemed to drop 10 degrees. Is this true? The colonel's question was quiet, but it carried the weight of judgment. Bradley's mouth opened and closed. No sound emerged. I have the whole thing on video. Hannah's voice cut through the silence. Every word, every threat. The moment he shoved Mr. Vance and grabbed for the flag. Colonel Morrison nodded slowly. He turned to the captain and spoke quietly. Make sure the commandant's office receives a copy, and contact the local authorities. I believe Mr. Whitmore may have some questions to answer about assaulting a Medal of Honor recipient. 2 police officers who had arrived with the growing crowd stepped forward, their expressions grim. Bradley Whitmore looked around wildly, searching for allies, finding none. You cannot do this. His voice was high, desperate. It was just a flag. I did not know. I did not know who he was. Corporal Jennings stepped forward, leaning on his cane, his old eyes blazing with righteous fury. You did not need to know who he was. His voice cracked like a whip. You just needed to have basic human decency. That flag represented something sacred to a man who had earned a right to fly it. And you try to take it away because it did not match your aesthetic standards. He spat the last words like poison. Men died for that flag. Boys who never got to grow old. And you called an eyesore. The police officers reached Bradley, flanking him on either side. One of them spoke quietly about assault charges, about disturbing the peace, about the inadvisability of resisting. Bradley's face crumpled, the last vestiges of his authority collapsing like a sand castle before the tide. As they led him away, Ezra called out, "Mr. Whitmore." Bradley turned, his eyes wet with humiliation and fear. Ezra's voice was calm, without malice, almost gentle. "I forgive you. I do not hold hatred in my heart. There has been enough hatred in my life. But I need you to understand something. That flag is not coming down. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. And if you ever threaten another veteran, another old person, another human being who is just trying to live in peace, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember what it cost you." Bradley said nothing. There was nothing to say. The officers guided him toward their cruiser, and the crowd watched in silence as the man who had tried to tear down a hero was driven away in disgrace. Colonel Morrison placed his hand on Ezra's shoulder. "Staff Sergeant Vance, would you permit us the honor of conducting a proper ceremony? A recognition of your service and your brother's sacrifice, here on this street where you have lived so quietly for so long?" Ezra looked at the flags lining Oakwood Lane, at the neighbors who had become family, at the veterans who had become brothers. "Yes, Colonel." His voice was stronger now, steadier. "But not for me. For Eli. He deserved a welcome home he never got. Let's give it to him now. 74 years late, but let us finally bring my brother home." The news spread like wildfire through channels both digital and ancient. Hannah's video had gone viral within hours, shared and reshared across platforms until the views numbered in the millions. The Shepherd of Chosen was trending. Elijah Vance's name was spoken on morning shows and evening broadcasts, and in living rooms across the country, where families gathered to watch the footage of an old man defending his brother's flag against a bully in Italian loafers. But it was the response from the military community that transformed Oakwood Lane. They came from across Tennessee and beyond. Veterans in pickup trucks with faded bumper stickers. Active duty service members who had taken emergency leave. Retired officers who had studied Ezra's action at Chosen and never dreamed they would have the chance to shake his hand. They filled the street and spilled onto the lawns and stood in respectful silence, waiting for the ceremony that Colonel Morrison had promised. The HOA board had called an emergency meeting the night before. Rosa had attended, along with Marcus and a dozen other residents who had witnessed Bradley's disgrace. The vote to remove Bradley Whitmore from his position as president was unanimous. The vote to permanently exempt Ezra's property from all aesthetic guidelines passed without a single dissent. And the vote to rename Oakwood Lane was carried with tears and applause. The new street sign had been installed at dawn. Elijah Vance Way. White letters on green metal, official and permanent, a testament to a 19-year-old boy who had given everything on a frozen mountain 74 years ago. Ezra had wept when he saw it. Standing in his dress shirt with his brother's dog tags around his neck, he had read the sign and pressed his hand to his heart and spoken words that only Rosa, standing beside him, could hear. "They know your name now, Eli. The whole world knows your name." The ceremony began at noon. Colonel Morrison had brought a color guard from the nearest Marine base. Young men and women in dress blues who moved with the precision of dancers, their white gloves bright against the red and blue of the flags they carried. A bugler stood ready at the edge of the lawn. A chaplain waited with a Bible and a prayer. But it was Ezra who stood at the center, beneath his brother's flag, facing a crowd that stretched beyond what his eyes could see. Colonel Morrison stepped to a microphone that someone had set up on the porch. "We are gathered here today to honor two Marines." His voice carried across the silent street. Staff Sergeant Ezra Nehemiah Vance, Medal of Honor recipient, who held a mountain pass alone for 19 hours and saved the lives of 847 of his brothers. And Private First Class Elijah Thomas Vance, Navy Cross recipient, who gave his life to save 3 wounded Marines and whose sacrifice exemplifies the highest traditions of the United States Marine Corps. He turned to face Ezra directly. "Staff Sergeant Vance, you have carried your brother's memory in silence for 74 years. You have flown his flag without recognition, without complaint, without asking anything from the country you served. Today, we ask you to accept what you have long refused, the gratitude of a nation, the honor you have earned, and the knowledge that your brother's sacrifice will never be forgotten. The color guard stepped forward, and Ezra watched as they performed the ceremony he had witnessed only once before at Arlington in the bitter cold of January 1951. The flag was lowered from its pole with reverent hands. It was folded with precise movements, 13 folds, each one carrying meaning, each one a prayer and a promise. When the folding was complete, Colonel Morrison received the flag and walked slowly toward Ezra. He stopped before the old man and extended the triangle of fabric. On behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your brother's honorable and faithful service. Ezra reached out with trembling hands and received the flag. He held it against his chest, his eyes closed, his lips moving in words no one else could hear. The crowd watched in sacred silence as 74 years of grief found its release, as a promise made on a frozen mountain was finally, fully kept. Then the bugler raised his instrument, and the first notes of taps floated across Elijah Vance's way. The sound was pure and piercing, each note a needle that found its way into the hearts of everyone present. Veterans wept openly. Civilians who had never served found themselves moved beyond words. Rosa gripped Marcus's arm as the melody carried across the neighborhood she had lived in for 15 years without ever knowing the hero who lived at the end of the street. When the last note faded, Colonel Morrison spoke again. "Staff Sergeant Vance, with your permission, the Marine Corps would like to present you with a new flag to fly in your brother's honor. One that will be replaced annually by active duty Marines, so that Elijah's flag will always fly fresh and bright above this street that now bears his name." Ezra nodded, unable to speak. Two young Marines stepped forward with a pristine flag, its colors vivid, its fabric crisp. They attached it to the pole on Ezra's porch and raised it slowly, carefully, as the crowd watched in reverent silence. The flag caught the afternoon breeze and unfurled fully, snapping in the wind, alive and bright against the Tennessee sky. And then something happened that no one had planned. It started with Corporal Jennings, leaning on his cane at the front of the crowd. He began to sing, his old voice cracked and wavering but unmistakable. The Marines' hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Other voices joined him. The color guard, Colonel Morrison, Tyler Reeves, and the young veterans who had stood with Ezra from the beginning. The sound swelled and grew until it seemed like the whole street was singing, until it seemed like the whole country was singing, a tribute to two brothers from Tennessee who had held the line when the line could not be held. Ezra stood on his porch, the folded flag pressed against his heart, his brother's new flag flying above him, and listened to the hymn he had sung as a young man on a troop ship bound for Korea. He had sung it with Elijah beside him, their voices blending, their futures unknown. Now he sang it again, his voice joining the chorus, singing for his brother, singing for the men who had not come home, singing for the 74 years he had carried alone. And somewhere, in the place where warriors rest and brothers wait, Ezra was certain he could hear Elijah singing too. 3 weeks had passed since the ceremony on Elijah Vance's way. The news vans were gone. The crowds had dispersed. The street had returned to its quiet rhythms of lawn mowers and birdsong and children riding bicycles in the fading afternoon light. But nothing was quite the same as it had been before. Ezra still woke at 4:30 every morning. He still made 2 cups of coffee and sat by the window watching the sunrise. But now, when the light touched the flag on his porch, he did not feel the weight of a secret. He felt the warmth of a promise kept. The letters had started arriving the day after the ceremony. Hundreds of them at first, then thousands, forwarded by the Marine Corps from addresses across the country and around the world. Veterans who had served at Chosin and survived to grow old. Children and grandchildren of men who had made it home because of what Ezra and Elijah had done. Strangers who had seen the video and felt moved to write. Each letter was a thread connecting Ezra to a world he had hidden from for 74 years. He read every one, and he answered as many as his arthritic hands could manage, sitting at his kitchen table with a pen and paper, the old way, the way that mattered. Rosa came by every afternoon now, not with casseroles, but with company. She would sit with him on the porch and listen to stories he had never told anyone. Stories about Elijah's childhood pranks and their mother's biscuits and the summer they spent building a treehouse that collapsed the first time they both climbed into it. She laughed at the funny parts and cried at the sad ones and never once made him feel like a relic or a curiosity. Marcus had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of Elijah Vanceway. He organized a neighborhood watch composed entirely of veterans, men and women who understood what the flag represented and who would ensure it was never threatened again. They took shifts walking the street, not out of fear, but out of respect, a silent honor guard for a man who had asked for nothing and received everything. Hannah had written an article that was published in a national magazine, a long-form piece about Ezra and Elijah and the meaning of sacrifice. The response had been overwhelming. A documentary crew had reached out. A publisher had inquired about a book. Ezra had declined them all, politely but firmly. His story had been told. His brother's name had been spoken. That was enough. But there was one invitation he could not refuse. The letter had arrived from the commandant of the Marine Corps personally, requesting Ezra's presence at Quantico for a special ceremony. The new class of officer candidates will be studying the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, and the commandant wanted them to meet the shepherd himself, to hear the story from a man who had lived it, to understand that heroes were not myths but men, ordinary men who had done extraordinary things when the moment demanded everything they had. Ezra had wept when he read the letter, not from sorrow, but from something else, something that felt like the beginning of healing after a wound that had been open for most of a century. He traveled to Virginia on a bright morning in late spring, accompanied by Rosa and Marcus and Hannah, the neighbors who had become family. Colonel Morrison met them at the gate and escorted them to a lecture hall filled with young faces, eager and nervous, on the verge of becoming the next generation of Marine Corps officers. Ezra stood at the podium and looked out at those faces, and for a moment he saw Elijah among them. 19 years old, full of hope, ready to serve. He told them the story, all of it, the cold that killed men where they stood, the waves of enemy soldiers that seemed endless, the 19 hours of holding a line that could not be held, and the moment when his brother threw himself on a grenade to save 3 men he had never met. When he finished, the room was silent. Then one young candidate stood and saluted. Another followed, and another, until every person in that hall was on their feet, rendering honors to a man who had never asked for them and a brother who had never lived to receive them. Ezra returned home to Elijah Vanceway as the sun was setting. The flag on his porch caught the golden light, rippling in the evening breeze, bright and new and alive. He sat in his chair and watched it for a long time, thinking about Elijah, about Margene, about the life he had lived and the years he had left. Rosa found him there an hour later, still watching the flag. "You did good today." She sat in the chair beside him, the chair that had been empty for 6 years. "Elijah will be proud." Ezra nodded slowly. "I spent 74 years running from his memory, thinking I did not deserve to speak his name, thinking I failed him by surviving when he did not." He turned to face her, and his eyes were clear. "But I understand now. Surviving was not the failure. Hiding was. Eli did not die, so I could disappear. He died so I could live, really live. And for 74 years, I forgot how." Rosa took his hand, her fingers warm against his weathered skin. "You remember now?" "Yes." Ezra smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried too long. "I remember now." He looked back at the flag, at the street that bore his brother's name, at the neighbors who had become family, at the life that had been waiting for him all along. "Still here, Eli." His voice was a whisper, a prayer, a promise renewed. "Still trying. And now, finally, I'm not trying alone." If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in disguise, that second chances are possible even after 74 years, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember, every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. The quiet old man tending his roses. The woman sitting alone at the bus stop. The veteran with a faded tattoo. Look closer. Listen longer. Because sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. Sometimes they are the ones who have earned the right to rest, but choose instead to keep standing. Keep watching. Keep honoring. Keep remembering. And somewhere on a quiet street in Tennessee, a flag rippled in the evening breeze, carrying the memory of a boy who never grew old and the brother who had finally brought him home.